solve this crime. The last thing that somebody needs when they're trying to protect themselves or a loved one from identity fraud is red tape. But unfortunately, resolving an issue related to a stolen Social Security number can be a long and complex ordeal, placing additional burdens on victims, and it extends time for criminals and fraudsters to misuse the Social Security number. As the creator and issuer of Social Security numbers, the Social Security Administration is uniquely positioned to not only combat Social Security number fraud, but also protect people whose Social Security numbers have been compromised from harm due to identity fraud. But Social Security's policies don't always make things easy. Today, we'll have an opportunity to hear firsthand about how difficult it is to resolve issues related to lost Social Security numbers or stolen Social Security numbers, and discuss some ways that the Social Security Administration can make it easier for Americans to protect themselves from harm before it occurs. If a burglar breaks into your house, you call the police. They don't tell you to wait a few weeks and hope that your situation improves. Instead, they send an officer to respond. It's not always how victims of identity theft are treated, and that's the problem. The American people deserve a similar response from government services when they are victims of identity theft. That's why I have partnered with Ranking Member Larson to reintroduce the Improving Social Security Service to Victims of Identity Theft Act. That would require the Social Security Administration to provide a single point of contact for individuals whose numbers have been misused and to help resolve cases as quickly as possible. We've also had a chance to hear from both We'll also have a chance to hear from both Social Security Administration and its Office of Inspector General about ongoing efforts at the agency to combat identity fraud and the ways these can be improved. The agency's records are valuable anti-fraud tools because they associate the numbers, Social Security numbers, with other verified identity data, such as the name, date of birth, and date of death. In limited cases, these records have been leveraged to help combat fraud by sharing death data with other federal and state agencies and by partnering with the private sector to establish electronic consent-based Social Security verification number, or the ECBSV. But as we'll hear today, there's more that the SSA and Congress can do to improve the effectiveness of these efforts. Identity theft is a serious issue, and we all have a responsibility to do a better job of protecting Americans from this threat and to restore the public trust. I want to thank our witnesses for joining us today, and we look forward to your testimony. I'm pleased to recognize the ranking member from Connecticut, Mr. Larson, for his opening statement. Sir, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm honored to join with you in terms of putting forward this legislation. As you've indicated in your remarks, identity theft is vitally important to the American people, as is Social Security itself, the nation's number one insurance plan, the nation's number one program with respect to making sure that our elderly stay off of poverty and our children stay off of poverty. And more veterans, of course, rely on Social Security disability than they do the VA. Yet, important as identity theft is, and it is, and we must take it serious, it's also important that we fund Social Security appropriately. And the Social Security Administration is the most effective and efficient agency we have in the federal government. In insurance parlance, they operate at what's called a 99% loss ratio. I come from an insurance capital. That means that they are able to operate their agency and serve the more than 66 million Americans with under 1% administrative costs. They don't need to be cut. They need to be enhanced, and especially in this area of identity fraud as well. And so I think it's incumbent upon us not only to strengthen the Social Security Administration so they're capable of doing their job, especially after the devastation we've seen from the pandemic and what that's done all across the country and the nation, and specifically with a agency. There is no other federal agency, none, that operates and administers what it has to do with under 1%. That is incredible. We should be striving to make a model of what Social Security does and how effective they've been in terms of getting, because they certainly, as we all would agree, having talked to our constituents, can do better. So, Mr. Chairman, I as well wanted to do this as well as at the start. I have a card for everybody. Even have your picture on it there, Mr. Chairman, but I'm going to have them pass it out for both Democrats and Republicans. I intend to give these to everyone in the Congress and what it is, and I hope that we can join together, because I think the most important thing that we can do with regard to identity theft and with regard to Social Security is enhance the program. And Social Security has not been enhanced since Richard Nixon was the President of the United States in 1971. There have been no improvements. So when you get your card, and Mr. Chairman, I took the liberty, I blew up your card and my card, but everyone is going to get these. And on it, it will tell you just how many Social Security recipients you have in your district. And then it will break it down to those children in your district that are getting Social Security, to those veterans that are getting that Social Security. But most importantly, and something we don't talk enough about as well, is how this is an engine for economic recovery. Mr. Chairman, you have 161,374 Social Security recipients in Georgia's 3rd, and monthly, your district get $270 million comes into the district. That's incredible. I have 662 Social Security recipients who get $270 million monthly. We have not improved or enhanced that in 52 years. A gallon of milk cost 72 cents in 1971. Obviously, everybody on this committee knows what's happened in terms of prices. And when you add that to what we're living in now, in terms of what political scientists and historians are calling a polycrisis, when you look at what's happening globally, just in the area of, let's say, the pandemic, the supply chain issues, the ensuing global inflation, and then add to that a global war, that's in essence what the Ukraine war amounts to, and you look at the pressure, who is the group that impacts the most? Seniors. How so? Everybody knows this, but we don't talk about it enough. Of the more than slightly over 1.2 million people who've perished in this pandemic, 855,000 were over the age of 65. Of the people that are impacted the most on inflation, those are people on fixed income. Those are the 66 million people on Social Security. They need our help, and they need it now. Not only in terms of protecting identity theft, but most importantly, the theft of not having their Congress do what it should do. 5 million of our fellow Americans get below poverty level checks, having worked all their lives and paid into a system that only Congress can change.
Mr. Larson, you've about a minute over here, and we all appreciate and share
My passion. Sorry that I went over time.
quite all right. This is an important topic, an important program, and in the coming
I
months.
apologize, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you. And while all of the points that you made are worthy of intense debate and discussion. Today, we do not want to miss an opportunity to focus on a very important topic, which is identity fraud. And so now I will introduce our witnesses. Mr. Sean Braun is the Deputy Commissioner for Systems and Chief Information Officer at the Social Security Administration. Ms. Katie Wexler is the Co-Executive Director at Consumer First Coalition. Ms. Margaret Hayward is a private citizen and a mother of three who has been invited to share her personal experience trying to resolve an issue related to her daughter's lost Social Security number. I'd also like to take a point of privilege to recognize your husband and children who are here. Thank you for joining us as well. We're glad to have you here and look forward to the commentary from the back row back there. Mr. Robert Roach, good to see you again as President of the Alliance for Retired Americans. And Mr. Jeffrey Brown is the Deputy Assistant Inspector General at the Office of Audits for the Office of Inspector General at the Social Security Administration. Welcome to you all, and thank you for your time today. Mr. Braun, your written statement has been made part of the record, and you are now recognized for 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Larson, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for inviting me to discuss Social Security Administration's role in combating identity theft. I am Sean Braun, the Deputy Commissioner for Systems and Chief Information Officer for SSA. Today, I will talk about our efforts to mitigate the harm resulting from criminals who try to misuse SSNs for their own gain. All of us play a role in finding the solutions to this misuse, and I greatly appreciate the subcommittee's many years of work on this important issue. The Social Security Act of 1935 did not mandate the use of SSN, but it did authorize the creation of a record-keeping system for accurate wage reporting. We designed the SSN to allow employers to uniquely identify and properly report individual earnings, and to help us track earnings, determine eligibility for benefits, and pay the correct amount. Today, almost 90 years later, the SSN remains at the core of our record keeping and is essential to carrying out our mission. Over many decades, use of the SSN for non-program purposes has spread. Businesses now use the SSN to track, identify, and exchange information about individuals. Data aggregators amass and sell large volumes of personal information, including SSNs, collected by businesses. As SSN use has expanded, so have incentives to obtain fraudulent SSNs. At one time, it may have been helpful to use the SSN as secret information, something that would only be known by the person to whom the SSN was assigned. That is no longer the case and has not been the case for many decades. The SSN was never and will never be evidence of someone's identity. It is simply a number associated with a specific individual in our records. Over time, SSN misuse and identity theft, including synthetic identity theft, have continued to persist. Identity thieves have learned to target children because of their credit history are clean and their records may be used for years before anyone realizes someone has stolen their identities or misused their SSN. None of this is acceptable. We understand the frustration, distress, and economic hardship SSN misuse and identity theft causes victims. As a matter of practice, online and in our field offices, we provide individuals who suspect their identities have been stolen with up-to-date information about steps they can take to minimize the damage caused by the criminals. We also help to prevent identity theft by continuing to work with government agencies and external groups to raise awareness of the problem. And we support our Office of Inspector General, Office of Investigation, in their law enforcement efforts to stop identity theft. Awareness, however, is only part of the answer. Even though we advise people to keep their SSN confidential, public and private data leaks have greatly reduced the likelihood that SSNs are secret. This is why SSA's lawfully authorized electronic SSN verifications have become so important. Annually, we perform over 2 billion automated SSN verifications through more than 3,500 data exchanges. Using electronic systems such as our Social Security number verification service and the electronic consent-based verification service, we are making it harder for identity thieves to operate. Given the importance of our electronic SSN verifications in defending against synthetic identity fraud, we are also working to expand the ability of federal benefits programs to use these services as part of their identity verification processes. We intend to enable federal benefit programs to verify SSNs directly or through other federal agencies using real-time verification requests. We understand the significant challenges associated with identity theft within both government and private sector. As long as the SSN remains key to accessing things of value, the SSN itself will have commercial value and it will continue to be targeted for misuse. SSA will continue to do what we can to prevent and mitigate the effects of SSN misuse, and identity theft. We stand ready to work with you and with other government and private industry partners as you consider ways to protect Americans' personal information. Thank you, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Brune. Ms. Wexler, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Ferguson, Ranking Member Larson, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify on SSA's role in combating identity fraud. I'm here to discuss a top priority of the Consumer First Coalition, preventing synthetic identity fraud through the use of SSA's electronic consent-based SSN verification, or ECBSV service, a service that, on a bipartisan basis, Congress directed SSA to establish. A criminal creates a synthetic identity by combining real information, such as a person's SSN, with fabricated information, using that to apply for credit and having a credit report created at the credit bureaus. With some patience, the criminal will spend time building up the credit profile of the synthetic identity. Later, the criminal obtains a large credit limit, maxes it out, and vanishes. The victims are the owners of the stolen Social Security numbers, many of whom are children. Over 1 million children a year are victims of identity theft. The fraud may only be uncovered years later when an 18-year-old applies for a student loan or credit card. Undoing synthetic identity fraud is a huge burden on that individual and his parents. This fraud costs the credit industry billions in losses every year, making credit more costly for all. Recognizing this fraud problem in the mid-2000s, SSA used its existing legal authority to create a paper-based service, enabling users for a fee to verify whether a name, date of birth, and SSN match SSA's records with written consent from the SSN holder. That paper-based process is too slow for our increasingly digital credit system. In 2018, Congress mandated that SSA create an electronic real-time version of the paper-based system. Thus, ECBSV became part of SSA's mission. This committee was essential to that enactment, as it unanimously passed the legislation that ultimately became the law. The ECBSV system allows financial institutions with a consumer's electronic consent to verify whether a name, date of birth, and SSN combination match SSA's records. The response is either a match or no match result. 22 entities use the system, many of whom are service providers submitting on behalf of multiple financial institutions. Our coalition has worked closely with SSA since the 2018 law was passed. I want to focus on the execution of this congressional mandate. Improvements are necessary for the viability of the program. I do not say this lightly. The ECBSV system is at risk of collapse if changes are not made. First, SSA must extend the timeframe for recovering the cost of the system. The law mandates that users fully reimburse SSA, and we wholly accept that obligation. However, SSA is attempting to recover $38 million in the next 3 years, a deadline not in the enacting statute, by substantially increasing user fees. There was a price increase last April, and another one takes effect in July. Some users will be expected to pay more than 22 times what they originally paid for the exact same system. If this continues, it's highly likely that current and potential users will be deterred. Some users may stop altogether, and some may submit transactions only for high-risk scenarios. That means fewer transactions, which could cause SSA to increase the fees again for the remaining users. That's not viable. We ask Congress and SSA to work with us to extend the cost recovery timeframe to 10 years. Second, SSA should explore ways to provide further detail on a no-match result. It's impossible to determine, based on that result alone, if there is synthetic identity fraud. Data shows that roughly 40% of the no-match results are fraud, while the rest are typos or another benign issue. Enhancements to the technology of the system and additional granularity, all while protecting consumers' privacy and data, are worth exploring. This could significantly improve the usefulness of the system and attract more users. Finally, SSA should consider how else eCBSV could be used. Other entities in both the public and private sector may find this system worthwhile. We have a vested interest in ensuring eCBSV is a success, as it could be a model of good government and public-private collaboration. If it fails, the only people that benefit are criminals. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Wexler. Ms. Hayward, we now look forward to hearing from you. You are recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Ferguson, Ranking Member Larson, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to share our family's story with you. Through no fault of her own, our infant daughter's identity was put at risk when she was just a few weeks old. This experience has been stressful for our family during an already vulnerable time and is something that I hope other families won't ever experience. At the beginning of August last year, my husband and I welcomed our third child shortly after relocating to Pennsylvania. When she was 7 weeks old, I realized we had never received her Social Security card. I checked the Social Security Administration's website and saw it was taking about 3 weeks to issue them. Being well beyond that window, I immediately called the 1-800-SSA telephone number. When I reached an SSA representative, he listened to my concerns, encouraged me to be patient, and give it a few more weeks. He told me it didn't matter if she had been assigned a number or not, because either way, I could just complete the form requesting a new card. I told him from an identity standpoint, it did matter. It mattered significantly. If she had already been issued a card, her identity could be at risk because someone else could have it. According to that representative, our only option was to request a new card. I could not receive her Social Security number over the phone, so we could begin the process of protecting her identity. Marcy and I would have to visit a field office, and the only way to be assured her identity was protected, assigning a new number, was not an option. Going anywhere with a newborn, much less waiting at a government office, is no small feat. For us, this requirement became extra challenging. I planned to go to the Social Security office right away. However, just hours after I called, our daughter became acutely ill and was admitted to the hospital for RSV. 3 weeks later, our child was finally healthy and durable enough to visit our local Social Security office in person. Off we finally went to the SSA field office to complete our online request for a new card and find out our daughter's Social Security number. The visit followed the same pattern. It was once again suggested I be patient and give it more time. And contrary to what the telephone representative told me, they also would not provide me with our daughter's assigned number. All we could do was finalize the request of a replacement card and wait. When it comes to protecting your child, waiting and hoping is not an acceptable course of action. When Marcy was 3 months old, the replacement card arrived and we finally learned our daughter's Social Security number. It was only then that we were able to begin the laborious process of monitoring and protecting her credit through each of the non-government credit bureaus. Her original card remains unaccounted for and could be in anyone's hands. The Social Security Administration personnel made what was already a stressful time even more difficult with inconsistent and inaccurate information. On top of the frustration, we had to weigh the risks of bringing a medically fragile baby to a field office to move the process of protecting her forward. Each interaction went the same way, repeating our situation and pushing to be connected to the right resources. Many parents don't have the education, time, or experience navigating complex systems that I do, and until this is fixed, it is their children who stand to lose the most. Before she was even a month old, a vital piece of our daughter's identity was compromised, and she has no choice but to use that number for life. As long as we are successful at protecting her, Marcy won't meet the SSA's threshold to receive a new number. At best, she will be inconvenienced with a locked credit forever. A singular, knowledgeable point of contact within the SSA who was familiar with our case and could help us navigate this process would have been immensely helpful. A new Social Security number for our daughter would prevent us, and someday her, from a lifetime of credit and identity monitoring, saving hours of time and years of stress and attention. Prior to our daughter's birth, I worked as a family nurse practitioner, and when it comes to one's health, prevention is so much more valuable than treatment. I'd like to see the SSA apply the same philosophy to identity protection. Even the threat of identity compromise is time-consuming and exhausting. I am heartened by the subcommittee's focus on this important issue and implore you to continue your work to ultimately pass legislation that will give my family and so many others readily attainable peace of mind. Thank you so much for allowing me to share our family story with you today.
Thank you, Ms. Hayward. Mr. Roach, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon. I'm Robert Roach, President of the Alliance for Retired Americans. I'd like to thank Subcommittee Chairman Ferguson and Ranking Member Larson, my good friend, and members of this committee for this opportunity to testify and participate in this hearing. Founded in 2001, the Alliance is a grassroots organization with 4.1 million members in 38 states, working to strengthen retirement security for all. Nearly 66 million Americans, 1 out of every 5 households, rely on Social Security's lifetime guaranteed benefits. These benefits are essential to all who rely on them, including seniors, people with disabilities, and their families of deceased workers. All Americans are rightly concerned about identity theft. Last week, as part of our Older American Month celebration, the Alliance held a retiree town hall with the Social Security Administration Commissioner. During that event, she specifically addressed the issues of fraud and identity theft and the efforts SSA is making to combat them. We applaud SSA's efforts to increase public awareness of fraud and identity theft. If the already short-staffed Social Security Administration was forced to cut the budget by 22%, as prescribed in House Bill 2811, the agency's work to protect Americans from identity theft would be hampered. In fact, the drastic funding cuts in the bill would dramatically reduce the services beneficiaries depend on. Less staff and fewer field officers will mean much longer waits for people who need information about their Social Security and Medicare benefits. People applying for Social Security and disability benefits will have to wait 2 months longer than they do now. Instead of shrinking the Social Security Administration's budget, Congress needs to strengthen the program, including providing adequate funding to administrate it. Administrative expenses come from the Social Security Trust Fund paid for by workers and employers. The Social Security Administrator's funding must be predictable year over year, especially at a time when 10,000 Americans turn 65 each year. Another way to strengthen Social Security is by passing legislation such as the Ranking Members Larson's soon-to-be reintroduced Social Security 2100 Act. Among the most critical items increases Social Security benefits, extends solvency of the Social Security Trust Fund, and repeals the windfall elimination provision and the government provision offset. The practical way to strengthen Social Security is by lifting the cap on Social Security payroll taxes above the current $160,200. Require the wealthy of us to pay their fair share into the system. This is much more about the numbers and how we pay for something. This is about people. Firsthand, I have seen people standing in line, senior citizens at my supermarket and other supermarkets who are leaving food at the cashier because they're unable to pay for food that they normally and customary buy. Coming from Pentagon City, where we spend $800 billion a year to protect the nation from foreign adversaries, less than a mile away, people are making decisions whether to buy food or medicine on a daily basis. In the world's most powerful, richest country in the world, this is just unacceptable. This is now a family issue because now, and everybody has a story. This is a family issue because as people grow older and because of the dwindling income that they have, because the decimation of pension plans and Social Security, as that kept pace with inflation, Everybody has a story about how they're taking care of parents and grandparents. Some of us have resources and others don't. At this committee in 2019, you heard the story of Katrina Brown, who was on her way to being a doctor, full scholarship to Ivy League colleges. And because her mother got sick, all that got put aside. Those are a few examples that underline our country's desperate need to expand Social Security benefits. Social Security importance cannot be overstated because of the decline in traditional pension plans, decades of stagnant wages that have made it harder for individuals to save for retirement. It is sapping our human resources because the youth are now taking care of grandma and grandpa. The U.S. Labor Department representatives for pensions and retirement say that almost 2/3 of beneficiaries receive 50% or more of the total income from monthly Social Security checks. And 1/3 of elderly beneficiaries count on Social Security to provide 90% or more of their income. Moreover, Social Security benefits are insufficient, evidenced by the average monthly Social Security benefit for a retired worker, which is a modest $1,833 a month. Our members are frustrated. And instead of acting, we want common sense changes enacted, and we want it done on a bipartisan basis. This is not a white problem. This is not a black problem. This is not a Hispanic problem or Asian problem. This is an American problem. And we anticipate, we hope, that the United Congress will pass a bill, 2100 Act or something similar, and work together to fix this problem for all Americans and all their families. We are in desperate times, and we put our faith and our hope in the good people that we send to Congress to help us fix our problems. These proposals,
Mr. Roach, thank you for your testimony. Your time has expired.
Okay.
Look forward to continuing the conversation. Mr. Brown, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and good afternoon, Chairman Ferguson, Ranking Member Larson, and members of the subcommittee. I commend you for holding this important hearing today on the Social Security Administration's role in combating identity fraud. Social Security touches the lives of every American. About 175 million people work and pay Social Security taxes, and nearly 67 million receive a Social Security benefit each month. As we heard in earlier testimony, the SSN was originally intended to track earnings, but it has become the de facto national identifier. This has given rise to individuals using other people's SSNs for illegal purposes. And as the chairman said in his opening remarks, the SSN has become the linchpin to identity theft, one of the fastest growing crimes in America, affecting millions each year. The Office of the Inspector General, or OIG, plays a vital role in combating SSN misuse and identity theft. And throughout our history, SSN misuse has been a priority in our oversight efforts. OIG has established a multidisciplinary team of professionals that develop and implement innovative approaches to combat identity theft and scams. This is done through audits, criminal investigations and prosecution, civil enforcement, and public outreach and education. I would like to briefly touch on these approaches. The OIG's Office of Audit identifies vulnerabilities in SSA's programs and operations that may result in identity theft. Our audits found, among other things, instances where fraudsters improperly use the SSN of older adults and deceased children. Our audit work also examined potential vulnerabilities in the internet services that SSA offers. Since the COVID-19 pandemic, users rely heavily on e-services, increasing the need for our oversight. We found that bad actors exploited some of SSA's public-facing systems to potentially commit identity fraud. These instances underscore the need for SSA to thoroughly evaluate its systems for potential vulnerabilities to ensure users are who they claim to be and that systems aren't misused. Many of the cases our Office of Investigations has successfully conducted involve SSN misuse, including synthetic identity theft. As we heard earlier, synthetic identity theft is a unique form of fraud that combines the SSNs of real people with fraudulent information, such as false names and dates of birth, to create new identities. It is one of the most difficult forms of fraud to detect because fraudsters build good credit over time using a fake profile before making fraudulent charges and abandoning the identity. For example, in one of our joint investigations, individuals were charged with using approximately 700 synthetic identities between January 2017 and August 2020 to open bank accounts and credit cards and to create shell companies. They are alleged to have fraudulently obtained over $20 million from the Payroll Protection Program. The pandemic resulted in criminals finding ways, such as the case I just mentioned, to fraudulently take advantage of the infusion of trillions of dollars in federal funding. Identity theft is a common thread running through many investigations related to the misuse of pandemic relief funds. Since the start of the pandemic, OIG has engaged with other law enforcement agencies, and we have been involved in over 150 investigations related to pandemic relief programs, funds, and scams. For over a decade, the American public has been plagued by scammers impersonating government agencies with the goal of stealing money or personal information, including SSNs. Safeguarding the public from financial fraud and scams is a top priority for the OIG. We hold a National Slam the Scam Day each year. This campaign amplifies our outreach efforts and encourages the public to hang up or ignore suspicious calls or messages. In other words, to slam the scam. We thank the members of Congress for helping to educate your constituents to protect themselves from Social Security-related and other government imposter scams. In conclusion, I want to thank the subcommittee for inviting me here today to highlight OIG's oversight and outreach efforts in combating and preventing misuse of SSNs. I'll be pleased to answer any questions you have.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. We are now pleased to recognize the chairman of the full committee, our colleague from Missouri, Jason Smith. Mr. Smith, you are now recognized for 5 minutes for an opening statement. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Chairman Ferguson, Ranking Member Larson. Thank you all for the opportunity to share a few remarks on an important topic that affects every American. We all know someone who has had to go through the ordeal of identity theft. One of the reasons I wanted to hold this hearing was after learning about everything our former colleague, Governor Kristi Noem, had to deal with after Congress publicly disclosed the Social Security numbers of her husband, all of her children, and her son-in-law. I asked the governor to share with this committee about her experience, the difficulties since her family's numbers were made available to the public, and what reforms we should consider through our jurisdiction to help families who find themselves in a similar unfortunate circumstance. I have with me a statement from Governor Noem expressing her appreciation for and interest in the committee holding today's hearing. Governor Noem writes in part, quote, "It is troublesome enough that identity thieves and fraudsters can try to steal our personal information right out from under us. But the government should not be doing fraudsters favors by improperly disclosing these important numbers that provide intimate access to one's identity. Furthermore, government should also be a help and not a hindrance for those whose Social Security numbers have been compromised. While disclosing your Social Security number for legitimate purpose causes millions to take a pause, it is even more alarming when a citizen can't trust their own government to keep their personally identifying information secure. Unfortunately, that is exactly what happened to me and my family when Congress exposed the Social Security numbers of me, as well as that of my husband, my 3 children, and son-in-law to the entire world. Governor Noem goes on to describe how the disclosure occurred and how she found out. Quote, "In December of 2020, my family and I provided our Social Security numbers to the White House as part of an official visit in my capacity as governor of South Dakota. However, these records went unredacted to the National Archives and were provided to the United States Congress. They were then needlessly and carelessly published, again without redaction, for all those on the internet. Unbelievable as that is, of equal concern, I learned of the public disclosure of our private information through reports in the media. That is outrageous. It wasn't a call from the Social Security Administration or from any of the governmental bodies who published our personal information for millions to see. Failing at each turn to safeguard the personal information entrusted to it, instead I learned from the media and reporters who reached out about the disclosure. In her statement, Governor Noem also highlights the financial fallout from this experience that has already occurred and the burden on her family going forward. She writes, quote, "My family has already had to spend time and money to protect ourselves from the government's careless disclosure of our personal information. And already bad actors have tried to use that information to their advantage. It may be years before we experience the full impact of this disclosure, but for the foreseeable future, we must closely monitor every financial transaction we see, realizing there may be ones out there we never see. Congress needs to take steps to not only better protect the Social Security numbers of American citizens, but for those who do have their numbers compromised, at a minimum, make sure they are made aware of such a disclosure. Additionally, we must cut the bureaucracy and red tape one must go through when trying to navigate the cumbersome and difficult situation of replacing their own or their child's Social Security number once it is compromised. I ask unanimous consent to insert the governor's entire statement into the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you. Thank you again to the witnesses for your testimony. We will now begin with the question and answer session, and I will begin. Ms. Hayward, thank you again for being here today, and thank you for sharing your story. You touched in your testimony about the difficulties that you experienced in trying to solve this problem. Tell us a little bit how a single point of contact would have made this easier for you.
A single point of contact would allow a certain amount of consistency, obviously. That would have been so helpful. I wouldn't have been jockeying around and starting from scratch every time I was interacting with a representative or person, an employee in the office. And having one person who could follow up with me and make sure that I was doing what I should be doing, make sure that, there wasn't anything that could be done to move things more quickly, because as we've learned through the testimony today, it sounds like the time that you don't know your number is time that you can't be protecting your child, in my case.
Okay. Thank you. As a follow-up question, you've obviously spent a lot of time on this. Personal resources that you and your family have had to expend on this, what do you think that cost is?
It's impossible to quantify the amount of time that we've spent, the worry, freezing her credit, trying to navigate all of the different elements between the Social Security Administration, FTC resources, the 3 non-government credit bureaus, and that's to say nothing of our actual experience just trying to acquire her replacement card. We've had to squeeze this in between school pickups, doctor's appointments, hospitalizations, and woken up in the middle of the night occasionally worrying about this. And this isn't going to go away either after this hearing. It will continue to be with us unless our daughter's able to get a new Social Security number.
Thank you. Mr. Brune, when someone like Ms. Hayward has a problem like this, what do you think the cost of that is to the agency in terms of a dollar amount to help solve this problem? I mean, what kind of resources does it take?
Chairman Ferguson, in our field offices and on our 800 number, we strive to provide courteous and empathetic professional service to each person who visits or calls. Each contact is handled with great care according to
I understand.
policy.
I'm looking for a number here. Does it cost, you think it costs $1,000, $10,000, $20,000 in agency resources to address the problem?
Well, I'm an IT guy, not the CFO.
All right, well, I'll tell you what, why don't we go to Mr. Brown? Do you have a rough idea of the cost associated with resolving, an average cost of resolving a particular case? Okay. Thank you. Ms. Wexler, the Social Security Administration, as you noted in your testimony, it will be updating its fee structure on the ECBSV service. I think you mentioned that you've got concerns about how this would impact usage. Can you dive into that just a little further and tell us what you anticipate?
Thank you for the question. I'd be happy to. We do think this new tier structure is going to discourage use from both the current users and possible users that aren't quite using the system. I want to give one example to help quantify this. So one user that initially was expected to pay $276,500 is about to be expected to pay $6.25 million for the same service. That's 22-fold increase over just 2 years. That discourages use. There's no way about that it does not discourage use. That's like Netflix saying your $15 a month subscription is going up to $330. So our concerns is this tight time frame for them to recover their costs is creating a vicious cycle. It would be less users, and then the cost would have to increase again. So we want to work with SSA and Congress to make sure that does not happen, because that is in no one's interest.
Mr. Brune, it's my understanding that the administration did not conduct an analysis of how increasing the fees on the system would affect utilization. So how did you determine the initial fee structure, and what considerations have been made for the subsequent fee structures?
Thank you for the question, Chairman Ferguson. The fee structure is based on input from the coalition and industry partners who use the service and their expected volume of verifications, as well as guided by the statute that authorized the program ECBSV and appropriations law, which requires us to collect their costs for building and operating the system within a specific period of time.
It seems like Ms. Wexler has an excellent point, that if you increase fees so rapidly that it's going to discourage use. Was that not taken into account when this new fee structure was put in place?
We've had extensive conversations and ongoing discussion with the coalition Ms. Wexler represents. And our intent is to incentivize usage, thereby increasing the number of verifications and generating more fees. We're open to further discussion with you about ways to resolve this challenge, and we do want to make it an efficient and effective service.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Brown, obviously, Social Security number fraud and theft is a real problem, and it's been done for basically the same way for a number of years now. A real threat on the horizon is artificial intelligence. Has your office been able to look at criminal activity around artificial intelligence? And also, do you think that your office and the administration is prepared to address theft via artificial intelligence in the future?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That is absolutely a rapidly evolving technology that I think we're all trying to keep up with. And I think it's important for the agency and for the OIG to monitor this very closely. Artificial intelligence has, I think, the opportunity for tremendous benefit to the agency in helping to process claims and handle its workloads, but there's also considerable risk if it gets in the hands of bad actors, risks that we can't even contemplate at this point. There has been an incident a few years ago where it did appear that artificial intelligence was calling the Social Security Administration to try to process direct deposit changes on behalf of Social Security beneficiaries. And we worked with the agency to alert its employees of this scam. But like I said, it's a rapidly evolving technology, and we need to keep tabs on this very closely.
Thank you. I now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Larson. You are recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank all of our witnesses also. And I'm sorry the chairman had to leave, but completely concur with him that that is a travesty what happened to Governor Noem, and we should be doing everything to make sure that sensitive data like that is always redacted, and that is a shame. I also want to thank the witnesses, especially Mrs. Hayward. You're a model for what an American citizen should be in terms of impacting your family directly and then seeking a resolution and then making sure that you're speaking out for the, as you indicated, the many mothers who perhaps aren't in the same situation like you and have taken the time and care or have that time and care to do that. Mr. Brune, how is it that her situation cannot be resolved more timely and given the individual the security and the notion that this is being looked into?
Congressman Larson, we regret the stress and confusion that was caused to Ms. Hayward. We do strive to provide timely answers. We're glad that the replacement for the SSN card was in fact issued after her field office visit. And we would be happy to work with Mrs. Hayward to identify if there's any other ways that we might improve our service.
Well, it seems to me like, and I know that there's difficulty in getting a new card, but her testimony seemed to indicate that she's not going to feel secure until they have been issued a new card. How long should that take?
In the state of Pennsylvania where Mrs. Hayward lives, I believe 3 weeks for the issuance of the card is still the case once it processes through our.
Well, could we charge you to be personally responsible to make sure that this matter gets looked into? And listen, as I said in my opening statement, and everybody should know this as well, and I think Mr. Brown brought it up when you asked him the question, Mr. Chairman, there are costs associated with all this, aren't there? And has the Social Security Administration been funded appropriately?
We've not done audit work to look at whether SSA has been funded appropriately.
And to make the technological, and the chairman is completely right too about artificial intelligence, after all the hearings that we've had on this and the capability that exists out there, we better get prepared real quick to deal with this. And that's not going to be something that we say we can reshuffle the agency and they're going to be able to do this on their own. That simply isn't going to happen. And most importantly, when we're talking about all of this, and Ms. Weschler, you brought it up, and I'm empathetic to your concerns, but you too said, was the cost $38 million, I think you referenced? You know, again, the agency is got to be able, again, to deal with the, Mr. Roach pointed out, the 10,000 baby boomers a day become eligible for Social Security. A day. That's 3,650,000 a year. So it'll be over 70,000 Social Security recipients within a couple of years. So we're going to need to have to fund Social Security. We're not going to be able to solve this problem by cutting Social Security and cutting benefits and cutting the agencies so that they can deal with this problem. And in fact, Mr. Chairman, I think we should look into, especially as it relates to artificial intelligence, what we have to do, because we may have to take that as a whole separate entity, but noting that this is the #1 insurance program for the country, and along with Medicare and the military budget account for 70% of our overall budget, this is an area where I believe that we can work bipartisanly to solve this problem. So no mother, and hopefully because of your efforts, Mrs. Hayward, that no other mother has to go through this process. But we have to make sure that we're providing the funding that's needed and further investigate technologically along with the humanization of our agencies as to how we can best operate.
Thank you, Mr. Larson, and I do look forward to bipartisan conversations related to this. Next, we'll call on Mr. Carey. You are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all the witnesses for participating in this very important conversation regarding the role of Social Security Administration in combating identity fraud. As many of our panelists have mentioned, Social Security numbers have become a common identifier for a range of purposes beyond what was intended to tracking income and Social Security benefits. Unfortunately, the frequent use of the Social Security numbers has exposed Americans to fraud, identity theft, which in turn causes unsuspecting Americans to become victims of fraud each year. While the financial loss is often borne by the financial institution, the owners of those stolen Social Security numbers are true victims. There was a study done, and we were talking about, Mrs. Hayward mentioned unmeasurable in terms of how much it costs you. On average, we've seen an estimate that 1 in 50 children were victims of identity fraud. The average cost to the family trying to resolve that issue is $372 in expenses. So I just thought I'd throw those numbers out. Recently, a constituent of mine back in my district had her bank account hacked and her identity stolen. The constituent's Social Security benefits were also stolen, and now the fraudster, believe this or not, has continually contacted SSA to try to get additional information. Now, my team back in the district is working hard to potentially get the constituent back their stolen benefits. However, we need to prevent this from ever occurring again. As my dear friend from Georgia brought up in his opening testimony, in 2021, an estimated 1.25 million children were victims of that identity fraud. As the users of Social Security numbers, the SSA is in a unique position to help combat theft and the misuse of the Social Security numbers. As Ms. Wexler mentioned in her testimony, to combat identity theft, Congress directed the SSA to establish an electronic consent-based verification system. So no financial institution can match a consenting, so a financial institution can match a consenting consumer's information with the Social Security numbers to verify their identity. Quickly, I'm running short on time. Mr. Brune, why is the SSN adhering so closely to a short time frame to recoup the costs of implementing the ECBSV?
The appropriations law requires us to recoup all our costs and sets a designated time frame for doing so.
Okay, so what plan does the SSA have in place to mitigate the risks of loss to the trust funds if the SSA fails to recoup the development and the operational costs of the ECBSV?
Congressman Kerry, as I mentioned in my prior response, we are committed to making sure ECBSV continues to be an efficient and effective operating tool to combat identity theft. We have ongoing conversation with the coalition Ms. Wexler represents to understand impediments to usage and to try to address them with your assistance.
Okay, so how many data exchange agreements does the SSA have with other federal and state agencies?
In total, as I stated in my statement, we have approximately 3,500 agreements and verifications where we verify SSN numbers and data associated with the SSN.
Okay, I got a lot of remarks, but let me just ask a simple question. If Ms. Hayward was worried, and she says she has to worry about it, and I believe, I mean, I got a 17-month-old, so I get it. Is it possible that that card was lost in the mail, right? Is it possible, I mean, your daughter's how old? She was
9 months.
9 months. Is it possible to get a new Social Security number instead of just a card? So we don't have to worry about, she doesn't have to do the monitoring like I have to do because my military records were breached? I mean, is that something that we can do?
Our policy does allow for that, and we would, according to our policy, we'd look at what options were available to, in this case, the young Mrs. Hayward, Miss Hayward. And it's not a panacea to issue a new number right as soon as they're issued.
But, I mean, if the kid is 9 months old, I mean, wouldn't it be better to do that than all of a sudden, 12 years from now, all of a sudden we've got to go back and we found out they've got a yacht booked off or booked in Boca Raton someplace?
We'd be happy to look into that for Mrs. Hayward.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pasquale, you are now recognized for 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman, every member of this committee that I've listened to for a few years and new folks support efforts by the Social Security Administration. I've heard nothing different. I don't know, maybe you have. To secure Social Security numbers and combat misuse and scammers. I've never heard somebody stand up and support that. You haven't either. But I want to highlight how Social Security is America's greatest achievements. We cannot let this hearing distract us. Some folks on your side have manufactured the crisis that threatens to blow up America's entire economy. If we breach the debt limit, we'll not be talking about one or two or three or thousands of frauds. Over and over, there are those in the Congress threatening to gut Social Security. I didn't read that incorrectly, and I didn't hear that incorrectly, nor did you. Some House members want to force Americans to retire later, work through illness, and make financial stability harder. As significant as this hearing is, you know it. You know the stuff already. We should be doing everything we can, day in and day out, to preserve Social Security. I mean, you talk about making public names. Look what they did to that poor woman 14 years ago. 14 years ago, what are we talking about it now for? Well, because it's either got to be for everybody or nobody. In the Lerner investigation, 14 Democrats were made to be axe murderers. And then no movements were made against them. They were innocent people. All may be funny to you, but it's not funny to me. Just want you to know that. 14 of us were investigated by the same folks you want to investigate, and you're right in doing it. But what's good for one should be good for all. So I want to ask Mr. Roach a question, if I may. My staff recently met with the AFGE, the union representing frontline workers at Social Security. They shared the anguish and stress of being unable to help callers quickly with existing staffing levels, just like we heard from the IRS. House members default on American Act would double down by slashing customer service funding. The Republicans' plan would cut customer service staff. Clear and simple. How would further cuts to Social Security Administration, Mr. Roach,
Well,
have a budget impact as far as you, because you've been there a little while, you know what's going on.
the services that have been drastically cut already, further services will be cut. People trying to get disability will have a much longer waiting period. And, offices have been closed and people are unable to get in touch with the Social Security office to get things done. It would be dramatic. It would be drastic for further cuts in the Social Security Administration.
By the way, Mr. Roach, if we have a default, and God forbid we have one, will the members that exist in your department, will they be able to assist beneficiaries in the event of a default?
I don't think there'd be any place to hide. I think that if there's a default, retirees will take the first brunt of it.
Mr. Roach, the study committee from the other side, God bless them, their budget plan lengthens the Medicare waiting period from 2 years to 5 years. This denies severely disabled Americans. There's a lot of those folks out there, Mr. Roach. I don't have to tell you. You could tell me better. But for 3 years, what the heck is that going to mean for those people waiting for Medicare okays?
It means that no one with disabilities severe enough to qualify for Social Security disability insurance should be without health insurance, period. It shouldn't happen. 2 years is already 2 years too long to wait. So clearly adding 3 more years for anyone waiting for urgently needed health benefits is cruel and unacceptable in a country as wealthy as ours.
And there is a 2-year wait for getting disability benefits, correct?
Gentleman's
I'm in the middle
time,
of the question. Can I finish it, please?
very quickly, my friend, very quickly.
I finished the question.
Okay.
The question. What does those 3 years wait mean?
It means that people will be, it means 3 additions for anyone waiting for urgently needed health benefits. That would be cruel and unacceptable in the country as well, that people will be out their benefits for 5 years.
Thank you, Mr. Roach. Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for putting us together today on this critical issue. We're all against fraud, though.
Absolutely. And
Thank
the
you.
good news is we're all against it and we're all here to help solve the problem. With that, the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Moore, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To all of our witnesses today, thank you for being here to discuss this really important opportunity to help protect our communities from fraud and theft. Right? We want to focus on this. These are important aspects of this subcommittee to be able to address this. And if we can, talk about these issues, we can help avoid more tough things like the Hayward family had to go through. So again, thank you for your testimonies. Ms. Welchker, sorry. The Social Security Administration is hoping to recover the costs of the ECBSV within just 3 years by raising rates on users. There's always externalities to this type of stuff and other unintended consequences. For the users who do continue to use the system, how will these costs be passed along to consumers?
Congressman, thank you for the question. I agree as far as the cost of fraud is felt by everyone that uses financial products or services. And that's why we're here today, is to try to solve that problem and make those costs not be as significant as they are. And the best way we can do that is to extend the time frame for ECBSV to recover that, or for SSA to recover the costs, and to make it as efficient and effective as possible, and talk about, other ways that ECBSV could be used. And then, really bringing some predictability and sanity to the fee structure.
Awesome. And continuing on with that, if more entities were permitted to use ECBSV and the base of users contributing user fees were broadened, this would alleviate some of the financing issues that we're seeing with the program. However, the question is whether it is appropriate to expand the number of entities permitted to use ECBSV. Do you think there are legitimate uses for entities in different industries, telecommunications, healthcare, you name it, to use this program?
I'm so glad you're raising this point, Congressman. Yes, absolutely. Our world is increasingly digital, and most sectors of the economy beyond financial services, they have a need to verify that a consumer is providing accurate identity information and is not trying to run a scam. So I think telecom providers is a great example of potential users of this system. Utility companies, residential landlords, others in the private sector, and maybe there's other ways for state and federal government agencies to be using the system. ECBSV put in a lot of resources for this system, and we think there is really strong reasons for expanding the use.
Thank you. Ms. Hayward, I have an 18-month-old at home too, and so I can only imagine having to, all you other have to dealing with what you've done. It's an incredible story, and I'm glad you're working through it, and appreciate you being here today. Identity theft is one of the fastest growing crimes in America. Shockingly, 1 million kids are victims of identity theft every year. Following your difficult experience addressing the issue for your child, in your opinion, what is one change that could be made to the Social Security Administration to improve customer service for individuals, trying to address identity theft? You've talked a little bit about having a point person and things like that. And candidly, I ask the question because this is something that we need to make sure we're doing across the board in our government agencies. And we talk a lot about the IRS. Our congressional offices are working closely with our constituents to help them to liaise on this. We've been a big, Republicans and Democrats have been a supporter of increasing the technology that they need to sort of get into the 21st century in a lot of cases. Is there things like that you're thinking of that you wanted to add to your testimony about ways to improve?
For us, the best way to improve would be to have a new Social Security number for our daughter. The ability to do that would really alleviate a lot of our time and effort in this area. And from that, the singular point of contact, someone who could knowledgeably provide us with the most up-to-date information as things change over time, would be immensely calming and helpful for a family in our situation.
Awesome, thank you. Mr. Brown, final question. You mentioned that Social Security Administration's OIG is working to find ways to defend against identity theft empowered by AI. Can you expand on the threats that are growing as a result of this?
Congressman, as I mentioned briefly earlier, there was an incident a few years ago that alarmed, I think, the agency and the OIG of what appeared to be AI making automated phone calls to the 800 number to redirect beneficiaries' direct deposits. Since then, we're seeing this technology evolve very rapidly, including just in the last few months, as we've seen in the media. We're playing catch up here. I think a lot of organizations are. So as I said earlier, it's something that we need to really get in front of as best we can.
Awesome, thank you. Thank you, Chairman.
Before I recognize the next member, the ranking member has requested a point of personal privilege. You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I looked out into the audience, I was pleased to see a dear person who I think in the minds of many of us up here will get a direct shot to heaven at some point. But we've been joined today by Elsie Pasquale as well, who's Bill Pasquale's beloved wife and someone we admire and deeply respect. Thank you for joining us, Elsie.
Welcome and thank you for being here. Next, we will recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Stubbe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The employer correction request notices, or the no-match letters, are letters that were sent from the Social Security Administration to notify employers when their employees' Social Security numbers did not match government records. It was established during the Clinton administration, and in the first few years, approximately 1.7 million workers responded to no-match letters and had their missing wages reinstated, which is a good thing. No-match letters were ended by the Obama administration 1 week after the DACA program begun, which initially required applicants to disclose any Social Security numbers they would have used, essentially admitting to a felony in writing. The Trump administration resumed the practice, sending out 1.6 million letters. Though there was a pause during the early part of the pandemic, these letters included a new attachment on instructions on how to register for and use business services online to view Social Security number mismatches. The Biden administration discontinued the practice again in April of 2021. Not every no-match letter means that there is fraud. When a woman changes her maiden name, for example, and doesn't notify the Social Security Administration as an example. If someone is unaware of a mismatch and has no opportunity to correct the errors, they would receive no Social Security benefits on account of the reported wages. Again, the Biden administration discontinued this practice, but appears to be relying on the business services online. The website says, "We have discontinued mailing EDCOR letters effective April 2021. We will continue to modernize our systems to make it easier for you to do business with us." Mr. Brune, the website says continue to modernize. What gaps are still in the business service online system, and how accurate is this new system in detecting both fraud and accidental errors?
Congressman, thank you for your question. The accurate collection of wage reports from employers is vital to our program. We work closely with the employer community as well as payroll providers to continuously improve our electronic wage reporting. Our free business services online system includes multiple tools for employers to reduce instances of no matches before, during, and after they submit wage reports. So instead of a letter after the fact, in real time, we're communicating with them after they've registered and authenticated properly. We're sharing with them as quickly as possible where they have inaccuracies that need to be corrected.
Would you be able to provide the committee with statistics on the effectiveness of the program?
We'd be happy to get back to you for the record, yes.
Okay. And what impact has this specifically had on illegal immigration employment?
Well, wage reporting is one of the mechanisms, but that's pretty much after the fact. We also support the Department of Homeland Security on E-Verify, and that allows a verification upfront at the time of request for employment.
So with the no match letters, with the end of no match letters, is the Social Security Administration being proactive in contacting American citizens when there are no matches, or is the expectation that the citizens must be proactive in reaching out to you?
As I said, we work closely with the employer and the payroll provider community, and they're responsible for communicating with their employee when a no match occurs, if that's appropriate.
Okay. Is there any value in continuing the use of the no match letters in addition to the business services online, especially for senior citizens who don't rely on technology?
We think the tools available in the business services online, which are largely used by the business and employer community, are effective because of their timeliness, how quickly they provide a match or a no match, and that allows more immediate action to address the situation.
So in the minute that I have left, how can we improve the Social Security Administration's collaboration with state authorities to ensure that they have the necessary technology to protect against data breaches?
We have many data exchanges with state authorities and continually work to provide verifications that support accuracy of federally administered programs.
So what tools are lacking, in your opinion, from SSA currently to protect American citizens? Is there things that Congress can do to ensure the protection of identity fraud and their Social Security number being fraudulently used that currently isn't available?
Well, Congressman, as you noted in your questions, and Mr. Brown has indicated, technology evolves rapidly. Responding to those evolutions in technology requires a continued focus on updating of our system and our policies and procedures. Those updates, obviously require funding to be implemented. I think that our verifications are robust. They cover not only federal use of the SSN, but we have extensive partnerships with state and local entities as well as the business community and the payroll provider community.
My time's expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Next, the gentlelady from California, Ms. Sanchez, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Larson. Today's hearing revolves around the Social Security Administration's role in combating identity theft and what fixes can be implemented to protect people from identity theft, which is a serious and an important topic. And I don't think anybody on this subcommittee will disagree with how serious this issue is or how seriously we take our role as members of Congress in finding a bipartisan solution to combat identity theft. And the witnesses today have provided some helpful suggestions on the steps that we could potentially take in order to combat this. But I'll note for the record that not one witness has suggested that we cut funding to the Social Security Administration or to the recipients who receive Social Security as a solution to combating identity theft. I just want to point that out because we are at risk of seeing massive cuts to the system that would be devastating. I want to turn my attention a little bit to an issue that is very high on the priority list of seniors in my district. I interact with seniors quite frequently, as often as I can. And while identity theft is an important issue, the issue that they most often raise for me is improving the cost of living adjustment formula to better reflect inflation so that they can actually make ends meet. Sadly, many of my Republican colleagues don't want to do that. Instead, the Republican Study Committee's most recent budget plan would cut the annual cost of living adjustments by using the Chained Consumer Price Index, which would result in a lower annual cost of living adjustment and less money for seniors to live off of. Mr. Roach, what would be the impact of a lower cost of living adjustment on retirees who rely on their Social Security?
Well, Social Security, as Ranking Member Larson indicated, hasn't had an improvement in 52 years. And the cost of living adjustment over that period of time has fell way behind the normal cost of living that it takes us to live. So to slow that and not increase it would be devastating on seniors, and again, seniors and their families who are trying to take care of these seniors. It would be a terrible thing to do, and again, it would be devastating on all our seniors.
Thank you. And Mr. Rich, that same report calls for the privatization of Social Security diverting worker and employee contributions directly into the stock market. How would privatizing Social Security affect benefits for recipients?
Another terrible idea. It would just enhance, investment bankers and those type of people. Today, the stock market is drastically down, and seniors would be hurting. And you can't depend on the stock market to feed your family and to feed yourself. As a result, this organization, Alliance for Retired Americans, was born out of fighting privatization of Social Security. Is money that is paid in to the system, and we demand that we get the money back that we put into the system, and we don't want to put that money at risk.
And if we were to follow the Republican Study Group's guide to privatize Social Security and the government were to default, what would that do to the stock market and to retirees' savings that they're depending on to live off of?
Well, I think if you look at the day, when I sat down here, it was already because some remarks were made that you may not get there by a public official, and it's already cratering. So it'd be devastating. The stock market was down, unless it got up, a little while ago. It was yesterday and today have been pretty much an example of what would happen if we default. We could just, basically, we default. Let me get real. We could just put up the Chinese flag and, be a third world country. That's what would happen.
I thank you for your honest and frank opinion. We know that Social Security is a popular program because Americans know that they can count on it. It's a guaranteed benefit, which you have said, they've earned after a lifetime of hard work and paying into the system. Along with many of my colleagues on this committee, we believe that the program needs to be strengthened for future generations. What are some fixes that Congress could make to the program to address to extend the life of the Social Security Trust Fund and increase benefits for recipients?
There's a lot. The CPI that we talked about could be more advanced and up to date for the current cost of living. We could increase benefits. We can make the program solvent so people are not worried about it every day. We could fix the many public sector employees that don't have access to Social Security. There's a whole number of things, and I believe the 2100 addresses all those concerns. And I think that's what we could do. And if you lift the cap of the 160,000, which the maximum people pay in, lift that and garner some of the wealthiest people in the country, we would have sufficient funds for Social Security to be self-sufficient. So basically, not asking for Congress to appropriate funds that they have to borrow. We're saying we want the funds. If you lift the cap, use the numbers, the system will pay for itself.
Mr. Rhodes,
Excellent. Thank you so much for your testimony, and I yield back.
Thank you. Next, I recognize the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Kustoff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for calling today's hearing, and thank you to the witnesses for appearing. Ms. Weschler, to you, as a means of prevention, would you recommend to somebody that they have their credit reports frozen in order to prevent Social Security theft?
Well, speaking personally, that's something that we do in my household. And after hearing my fellow panelist's story, I'm going to take the process to do it for my young children as well.
Yeah, so I want to follow up on that. Ms. Hayward, after what happened to your daughter, you personally, you had you and your husband's credit reports frozen, right?
At this time, we've been focusing our attention on our daughter and our children and learning more about what we need to do to protect ourselves.
Yeah.
As you can understand, it can be difficult for an independent citizen to know exactly what the best practice would be, and it has ramifications when opening a line of credit or taking out a loan or buying a house. So at this time, we're still trying to figure out what the best course of action would be and are hoping that we can be provided with the best information to follow.
Fair enough. Thank you. Ms. Weschler, back to you. There's a difference in the process between freezing the credit of an adult versus a minor child, isn't there?
That's my understanding, yes.
Okay. And it's more complicated, maybe substantially more complicated to freeze the credit of a minor child versus an adult.
I can tell you just because I've done a little research on what that looks like. Yes, there's a lot of documents we have to provide as the parents of the children.
Good, thank you. If I can, Mr. Brown, as it relates to you and to OIG, can you talk about the scammers who target, I guess, individuals versus groups? Because they're both, right? There's some that are individuals, there's some that are professional groups.
The scammers are, yes, individuals or groups. Mhm.
Okay. Can you talk about the different types of groups that conduct the scamming?
I think I can refer to drawing on that example from a few years ago. The artificial intelligence that was likely backed up by unknown individuals, not likely one individual, and it was difficult to track the perpetrators down because this is all being done electronically through voice over internet telephone systems, calls that are being originated from outside the United States. So my point here is it's very difficult to identify the perpetrators, whether they're individuals or groups.
And the ones that are coming from outside the U.S., do you know or do you have an opinion where they're coming from?
I'll have to get back to you on that. I think our investigative work has tracked some of that down, but I don't have the information readily available.
Thank you. You coordinate with different law enforcement agencies,
We do.
primarily the FBI.
Correct.
Can you think of any prosecutions in the last 5 years of these scammers?
Unfortunately, my background is in the Office of Audit. The investigative side is not sort of in my portfolio, so I'd be happy to get some more information for you for the record.
Yeah, I would appreciate that if you could let me know if there have been any prosecutions, because it would seem like, I'm a former federal prosecutor, former U.S. attorney, that, you know, when you have one or X number of successful prosecutions, that it sends a strong deterrence effect to those who think about trying to perpetrate the same or similar crime. Now, a lot of times they'll adapt, and sometimes after the expansion of time, they seem to go away, but the more of those investigations and the more of those prosecutions and the notoriety that they receive, that there's no doubt that there's a deterrence effect. So if you could follow back up with me, I appreciate it.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, as my time is expiring, I yield back my 10 seconds.
Thank you. Before we go to the next member, the ranking member and I have both commented several times on the artificial intelligence piece. And Mr. Brown or Mr. Brune, Mr. Brown specifically, you keep going back to the one incident that you've been made aware of, which was a program that was calling in. Are y'all doing anything right now to kind of survey where you may be in this process? I mean, you're aware of one thing, but how much, is there a way to track penetration from AI into the system? I think we're just both kind of, concerned about this. So are y'all doing anything to monitor that, or is it hard to do because you don't know what it is yet?
Hard to do because we don't know what it is yet, also hard to track where it's coming from. So we are looking at data to try to decipher where these potentially fraudulent calls are coming from. But fraudsters have found ways to spoof legitimate phone numbers, redirect calls so it looks like they're coming from within the United States when they're not. So they're always, sort of one step ahead of us, and we're trying to catch up here.
Okay, thank you. Next gentleman from Arizona is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And to I'll call him my friend, ranking member, he and I both have a fixation on the stability and survival of Social Security, though I think we see the actual financing mechanisms very different. We did some of the math last night on the floor and showed that if you were to stabilize U.S. sovereign debt at 95 to 97%, because the real problem is actually more in the Medicare, I need a 24% payroll tax tomorrow and a 20% VAT tax tomorrow to stabilize U.S. sovereign debt to 97% of debt to GDP. That is the CBO math. And so you can go, if you want to argue, go argue with CBO. Mr. Chairman, at my time. Back about 2 years ago, we actually had a hearing in this room, maybe even 3 or 4 years ago. Actually, I think you may have been in the chair. And there was one of the discussions was, is there a way to actually sort of have a revolution on how we both have a more, as we're using a social security number or an national ID number functioning is what it becomes for Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, so many other items, to have a rotating encryption on it. We actually, I think at that time, had a technology expert come speak to us saying, okay, just like, you know, here's the number, but underneath it is always a token that's rotating, or some sort of ability like this. Because my fear is if I'm reading the materials, or even, and I'm sorry, I ran back to the office to see if I could find the binder. I couldn't find it from a couple of years ago that had some of the material in it. Has there been any type of research project, whether it be at the Social Security level, you know, the IG, someone saying, as technology gets better, as the AI gets better, as the data mining gets better, the fraudsters are going to get better. Is there a way we could build a much more bulletproof token that is also that tax ID? And you seem to have the most expertise on this. I mean, what would you do?
I appreciate the question, Congressman. I am not a technology expert, but I work with them, and we're happy to have these discussions. I do agree as far as the strong reliance that our country has on Social Security numbers, and that makes it such an attractive target for fraudsters. And that's, you know, why we have so much focus on the ECBSV program, but we're happy to have more discussions about that.
But within that, I think actually we had some testimony in the back that the amount of fraud that's in our Medicare system, even our Medicaid systems, often using, walking into an emergency room and using someone else's Social Security number and these things. So this is a much greater scale than I fear we completely have our heads around. And maybe the goal here should be not only identifying the problem, because we seem to do this every couple of years, but are we ready to bring in some true experts? Is there a way, you know, if I can carry around my bank accounts on this thing and they're substantially bulletproof, is there a way we could provide that type of protection to the American taxpayers? And just everyone, because, you know, we all have to live with this number. And other thing, how old's the little girl?
Our daughter's 9 months old.
So cute. The insane thing, I have a 10-month-old little boy we just adopted. And so you're hearing your story, and I'm all of a sudden going, oh, God, we need to check. So you see what you caused? But to everyone on the panel, and then I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman, if you come across any literature discussion of what we could do to actually fix this. You know, I'd love us to actually be working on a fix instead of planning for next year's hearing again to do the same thing over. So with that, yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Higgins, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, it's long been known and long ignored that Social Security has a customer service problem. You know, benefits are not cut, but when the administration is cut, it makes services for our individual constituents, every congressional district, very, very difficult. Next Friday, $25 billion in Social Security benefits are scheduled to be paid out, but will not if the nation defaults on its debt. You know, if there's a problem with fraud and abuse, whether it's an internal source or an external force, you know, the logical extension is that resources, that money is needed to fix that. President Biden proposed budget increases to improve Social Security services, including cutting fraud and theft by nearly $2 billion for a total of $15 billion. $224 million was to protect the program's integrity. Part of the program's integrity is to ensure that it fulfills its mission in a way that is effective and efficient, because every single week, $25 billion in Social Security benefits are paid out. That's $100 billion every single month. These are people that primarily depend on those resources to survive. Additionally, they are net contributors to the American economy. These people do not save their Social Security payments. They spent a whole life contributing to it so that they could experience a life of dignity. You know, there's a lot of talk about, you know, debt and deficit, and both parties are responsible, and that's true. What's not talked about as much is that American debt in the form of treasury bonds, bills, and securities is the greatest, safest investment in the world. When there is a global recession or a national recession, it's called a flight to safety. That's what world markets buy, because 60% of the world's economy is dependent on the American dollar. The full faith and credit of the United States shall never be questioned. That is the gold standard by which people invest in American debt. Yeah, the debt's a problem, but the way that you deal with that is through economic growth. And anybody that questions whether or not growth can do that, look back to the 1990s, 1992 to the year 2000. Sustained economic growth of 4% every single year for 8 years. We did not have budgetary deficits. We had budgetary surpluses of $300 billion. We paid $400 billion down on the national debt. That kind of growth was only made possible by the investment that this Congress made in the American people and the growth of the American economy. And somebody says, well, you have 4% growth, you have an inflation problem. No, you didn't. Inflation was at 2.25% for that 8 years. You know, you can't continue to hold the American people hostage because of a debt situation that you helped create. 70% of American debt is owed to Americans. Guess what the Chinese would love? They would love for us to default on our debt. You want to know why? Because they want to be the world's lead currency in the yen. The other issue, which I still don't understand, but our friends on the other side in the House Ways and Means Committee prioritize who would get paid if we defaulted on our debt. And China was first. Not the American people, not the Social Security program, not the Medicare program. So I just simply want to say, and I've heard very clearly your testimony. It's been very valuable to me in terms of learning a little bit more about this extraordinary program that, by the way, lifted 50% of American seniors out of poverty when it was enacted in 1935. We have a demographics problem. People are living longer. We should be celebrating that. And that's why John Larson's Social Security 2100 Act is so visionary, is so valuable, not only to the American people, but to the American spirit. I see my time's expired. I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Higgins, and we all agree that raising the debt ceiling is something that should be done. We cannot default on the debt, and House Republicans have been the only ones in Washington, D.C. to vote to raise the debt limit so far in this discussion. With that, I will yield to my colleague from Iowa, Mr. Feenstra.
Thank you, Chairman Ferguson, and I also want to thank Ranking Member Larson. Thank you for having this hearing, and it's really important. And, you know, collaboratively, all right, I don't care about politics. I care about solutions, how we can work together. You came here, each one of you came here to give testimony. You came here to discuss this critical issue that we have in front of us, and we need to find a solution together, and I thank you for that. In Iowa, our state has already received more official complaints of identity theft this year than all of 2022. And we're not even 6 months into the year yet. So this is a real concern. And so, Ms. Wexler, I'm just curious, do you have any idea why we're seeing such an onslaught of identity thefts starting already this year compared to years past? And by the way, is this nationally or is it more Midwest driven?
Thank you for the question, and sympathetic that so many of your constituents are already victims of identity theft this year. We are seeing that nationally in identity theft, but also specifically synthetic identity theft and fraud. It is the fastest growing type of financial crime in the U.S. And synthetic identity fraud is the largest type of identity theft. And it's not just in the credit industry, but it's in other sectors of with government benefits and unemployment benefits. And we've heard from some of my fellow panelists on that. And that's why, again, ECBSV is such a critical tool for combating synthetic identity fraud. And we have to maximize the use and the effectiveness of this system.
So I agree. Thank you for those comments. I want to extrapolate it on that just a little bit. So with AI, what's happening in AI, do you think, I mean, I get worried when you see things doubling so quickly. Do you think AI is the biggest producer of what's happening, phishing attacks and all this other stuff? I mean, is this something that, oh, wow, I mean, we got problems ahead of us? What is your thoughts?
I mean, I know data breaches are more and more common, and that is certainly an opportunity for Social Security numbers to become vulnerable and then be taken over.
Yep.
So is there other technology that's making that possible? That's very likely.
Yep. So I sat on the Science, Space, and Technology Committee last year, and I was a ranking member of the Research and Technology Committee. Talked a lot about artificial intelligence, and obviously it's a safety issue. Are you working with other agencies? I'm just thinking out loud here, like NIST, NSF, DOE. Is there any way that you guys can work collaboratively? I mean, it just seems like I'm hoping it's not the case that we're all in little silos trying to do our work. I mean, is there ways that we can work together with some of these that we're all trying to somewhat combat this situation? Any thoughts there, Ms. Wexler, or anybody else?
We are certainly open to collaboration across the public and private sector. That's certainly what we're trying to achieve with ECBSV, and on a larger scale, absolutely.
Yep. Anyone else that you see, hey, we're doing X, Y, and Z with this different organization?
Congressman, at the Social Security Administration, we're very collaborative with our federal partners and with the technology community who not only provisions technology to the government, but to the nation. In recent discussions, we've coordinated with multiple executive branch agencies to both learn more about the emerging technologies and identify positive use cases that help the government mission.
Awesome. I'm glad to hear that. So we're Congress. I'm asking you questions. I want to ask you, what can we do? All right. What do you see that Congress can do, Mr. Brune and Ms. Wexler? All right. If you could say, hey, if you guys could do this, if you men and women could do X, what would that be?
Well, Congressman, I would say that as technology advances and as threats, as you have identified, change, adequate sustained funding is an important measure to continue to advance the government's defenses.
Yep. Thank you, Ms. Wexler.
Just the important role you've played in making sure ECBSV was created to begin with, and then ensuring its efficiency and effectiveness.
Perfect. Thank you so much for your testimony, and I yield back.
Thank you, our dear friend and colleague from Michigan. Glad to have you back, sir, and healthy. You're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. It is good to be back. I will say, and I've mentioned this a couple of times, I'm not 100% yet. It still hurts for me to talk, which makes this a completely shared experience. I do want to thank the witnesses for being here. And I do agree with my colleagues, and I'm glad this conversation is taking place. The notion that Americans, like Ms. Hayward and others, have to deal with the frightening reality of identity theft is something that we have to take very seriously, and we have to deploy whatever capacity, whatever technology, whatever policies we can to try to address that. And I'm pleased to hear that that there are some ideas that we might need to invest in. We need to hold these bad actors accountable. But we do also have to recognize that everything we do here has some impact on the capacity of the agency to address that. So I am concerned, as some of my colleagues have expressed, that any steps that we might take that would potentially limit the resources available to the Social Security Administration or any other body of government could have the exact opposite effect of what we're trying to address during this hearing. According to the Acting Social Security Commissioner, some of the cuts that could be proposed, for example, in the so-called Limit, Save, and Grow Act, at least this is according to the Acting Commissioner, could force the agency to close field offices, lay off, quite literally, thousands of people who go to work every day trying to make the agency's mission more achievable. I think about this, in terms of how it affects the people I represent. Back home in Michigan, 2 million seniors rely on Social Security. And as Mr. Larson, who has supplied us regularly with data, my particular district is one that has a fairly high number of Social Security recipients, both seniors but also other beneficiaries of Social Security. And I'm very concerned that we not talk about steps to address identity fraud and at the same time weaken the ability of the agency itself, of the administration, to address this. So if I could, starting with Mr. Roach, ask if you might just comment on how the proposed program, and I know this is not something that is necessarily shared by all members on the other side of the aisle, but majority of our Republican colleagues are a member of the Republican Study Committee that put forward these proposals, how this impact the loss, for example, of field offices, the loss of employees who go to work every day trying to make the Social Security Administration more responsive to those Americans who have paid in. What will be the impact on our ability not just to deal with this issue of identity fraud, but of all the challenges that come with running the large organization that provides benefits that for many of the people who are the beneficiaries is their principal, if not their sole source of income. Mr. Roach, could you just comment on that?
Yeah, well, I know firsthand, I had a problem with Social Security, I needed assistance. They had closed my office in Arlington, Virginia. I would have to travel many miles away. The phones wasn't being answered in a timely fashion to call you back. It'd be devastating. Many seniors are confined. They have to communicate and try to get information on various issues that come through. And every year there's a different issue. So it'd be a devastating thing to continue to to continue to do what's already happening and not, expand those offices and expand the ability to communicate directly with Social Security. As you said, communicating is very tough. And we cut staff, nobody's answering the phone. And so it'd be worse and exacerbating a bad situation.
Well, I appreciate that. And I would just add to that by saying that I also think we ought to be careful. And I know, again, this often comes up where some would criticize the people who work in the Social Security Administration or any other agency of government as being, bureaucrats and subject to all sorts of, I think, really unfair characterizations. These are Americans who go to work every day to serve their fellow American citizens. We ought to hold them up. We ought to support them. And especially when we're trying to deal with this really significant threat of identity fraud. Let's not, on one hand, say that we want to stop that, and on the other hand, make it more difficult for the people who go to work every day trying to address these problems to get their work done. So with that, again, Mr. Chairman, thanks for holding this hearing. I really appreciate it very much. And I appreciate your nice comments at the outset. Thank you.
And you'll appreciate the fact that I agree that was not entirely too painful for either of us. With that, the gentleman from Ohio, Dr. Winstrup, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, I too want to welcome my friend back. I'm glad you're doing well. And I want to thank you, Chairman Ferguson, Ranking Member Larson, for having this committee and for all of you being here today. The fraud is of great concern of mine. Child identity theft is a serious problem in our country. I'm concerned that maybe the Social Security Administration isn't doing enough to protect our children and grandchildren from having their identities stolen. That's one thing, but maybe there's more we can do to protect these children, and that's where I want to go. Children's identities are valuable to criminals. It's a bonanza for them when they get it. They can go undiscovered for years until that child is old enough to work, drive, or try to establish credit, and then it comes forward. And when children's Social Security numbers fall in the hands of the wrong person, it sets a stage for a future of financial hardships and problems before a child is even old enough to walk. I do want to talk about the Social Security Child Protection Act. You know, as made clear by Mrs. Hayward's testimony today, Social Security Administration's current policies make it extremely difficult for families who are trying to obtain a new Social Security number after being a victim of a comprised Social Security number. I can tell you firsthand, when you adopt, not immediately at birth, but say maybe months later, the advice you are given as parent of that child, new parent of that child, is get a new Social Security number because of this very reason. Fortunately, we were given that advice and did just that. It's just shocking to hear it's such a vital piece of a child's identity was compromised before she was only 1 month old. And fortunately, the story's not unique, apparently, and that's why we were given the warning. So I want to make sure that people can address this and have the ability to protect their children from having their identity stolen and deserve the opportunity to open bank accounts, et cetera. So that's why last Congress, I worked with my colleague, Representative Blumenauer, to introduce the Social Security Child Protection Act. This common sense bill would allow Social Security Administration to issue a new Social Security number to children age 14 and under if their Social Security number has been compromised by theft of their Social Security number. So we're planning on reintroducing this act this week, and I invite all the members here to join in this effort to protect our children and assist their families when their lives have been upended by child identity theft. The Social Security Administration has a responsibility to provide protection for our children to prevent what happened to Mrs. Hayward and her family from ever happening again. I think we can make a big dent in that if we work together on this. Mrs. Hayward, can you discuss how things may have been different for you and your family if the Social Security Administration would have had the ability to issue your daughter a new Social Security number when you realized it had been compromised?
Thank you. Yes, you know, from my understanding, from what I've been told, is that we have to wait until there's been some harm incurred. We have to have substantial proof of that harm, which can take months, years, maybe even decades to even learn about. And so if we'd been able to have a new Social Security number given to us, even though we didn't have proof of harm yet, thank goodness, then it would save us and buy us more time to do what we needed to do, apply for a passport, open a 529, that sort of thing, and give us a peace of mind that at least she's working with a clean slate.
Thank you very much. I yield back, and I hope we can get this act passed. It's a bipartisan. Let's work on that and help others out. Thank you. I yield back.
Okay, thank you for reintroducing that. Look forward to working with you to get that across the finish line. Next, the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Davis, you are now recognized for 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and let me thank you for giving me the opportunity to weigh on to this hearing. I'm not a member of the Social Security Subcommittee, but I have such a vital interest, and Social Security is so important to the district that I represent that I wanted to make sure that I heard what I could hear and that I contributed whatever it is that I could contribute. I'm very interested in fraud and in Social Security, but I'm really more interested in Social Security than I am and fraud. Both are very important, and we want to eliminate as much of it as we possibly can, not only in terms of individuals attempting to what we call in the community where I live, pimping the system. And we certainly don't want to see the Social Security system pimped. But we also want to be careful that we don't eliminate and leave out. I recall how Social Security sort of came into being and people who were left out. And I'm sure that the designers and promoters did not intend, but I grew up in rural America, and many of the people that I grew up with were farmers. They were sharecroppers. And so they went many years without paying into Social Security. They were not allowed to pay in. Therefore, as they reached retirement age, or even as they reached the age where they could contribute, and my father was one of those individuals. So I know exactly when they were able to contribute, and I also know exactly what his Social Security check was. After he retired, he lived with me, and he was 92 years old. His check was $536 a month. And he was a very proud individual. And oftentimes, if we went to dinner or whatever, he would attempt to pay. He said, "Oh, let me pay for this." He'd reach up and pull out his money, and he'd always say to my wife, "Vera, I'm paying for your dinner. Now, your husband can, do the best he could." But I thought if he only had $536, fortunately, he was okay. He had children that he could live with and all of that, and so he didn't have to worry. So I think we have to be very careful. And I'm hearing, people wanting to raise the retirement age. Well, I think we need to be very careful about that as well. I think one of the reasons that Social Security has been so popular is that people know that they can depend on it. Social Security benefits for many people, of course, is about $20,000 a year. Many of the individuals in my district, it's about half of that. It's about 20,000. It's about 10,000 for them. And that's what many of them get. So I want to make sure that we protect Social Security as much as we can. And I hear this thought and this idea about privatization and privatizing. Well, I think to me, that's kind of like a gamble. And you never know what the outcome is going to be. So, Mr. Roach, let me ask you, the idea of privatizing Social Security, how do you react to that?
Our members that would not be satisfied with that. My organization, Alliance Retired Americans, was born out of the initial talks to privatize Social Security and put our money at risk. We put the money in trust to the government, Social Security, and we depend on that money coming out. And to put it at risk in stock markets and other financial instruments would be devastating mentally and physically to our members and Social Security recipients as a whole.
And the idea of more of a guarantee, how does the idea, because we have been fortunate We've never missed a payment yet, and people have been able to reap the benefits and have the security of just about knowing, and they wait for the first of the month.
Absolutely. The guarantee of the federal government means it's very comforting to all of our Social Security recipients. The fact that they're not have to look at the stock market go up and down, and people who have money outside of Social Security, they're more vulnerable to fraud and theft because the numbers are all over the place, and it's very difficult to keep track of these things. We're doing some work in that arena, but no, privatization and lack of a guarantee would be devastating to Social Security recipients and potential future Social Security.
Thank you for your comments, Mr. Roach. The gentleman's time has expired. I'd like to thank each of our witnesses for coming today. Your testimony has been helpful. It has caused us to want to explore this area even more and really be a partner in helping solve this very serious problem for our fellow Americans. Please be advised that the members have 2 weeks to submit written questions to be answered later in writing those questions, and your answers will be made part of the formal hearing record. With that, the subcommittee stands adjourned.